What if I told you that the fastest accelerating production car ever built in Australia wasn't a V8? Almost no one knows this, but a 6-cylinder engine fitted with 3 carburettors hit 100 kilometres an hour faster than nearly every V8 that rolled off an Australian production line. And the most complete high-speed performance machine this country ever produced was so frighteningly capable that when its successor was announced, the government didn't regulate it. They cancelled it entirely, before a single example reached the public. These are the 14 most powerful classic Australian muscle cars ever built, and some of what you're about to hear will genuinely surprise you. The HQ 350 had the right engine in the completely wrong body. Chevrolet's 350 cubic inch V8, pushing 275 horsepower, was serious muscle by any standard of the era. On paper, it looked like a heavyweight contender. On the road, it drove like a luxury cruiser wearing a fighter's outfit. Holden had softened the suspension tuning for comfort, and that single decision quietly strangled everything the engine was trying to do. The weight penalty showed every time a lighter, sharper rival pulled alongside. It ends up at 14 not because it was bad, but because everything above it was simply more serious. The XA Falcon GT should have been the most terrifying Ford ever built in this country. The 351 Cleveland V8 had roughly 300 horsepower, the pedigree of the legendary HO cars that came before it, and then the government ruined it. The 1972 supercar scare, driven by media hysteria about high-powered cars on public roads, forced manufacturers to cancel or rethink high-performance programs. Ford didn't just soften its messaging, they deliberately crippled a car that should have dominated. Coming up is a 6-cylinder that made V8 owners question everything they thought they knew, and the car that started the entire supercar war between Ford and Holden. The Chrysler Valiant V8 Pacer is one of the most underrated performance machines this country ever produced. The legendary 265 cubic inch Hemi 6, pushing approximately 280 horsepower, near Charger-level performance in a body most people completely ignored. It was brutal, lightweight, and savage in a straight line. The problem? It lacked the full aggressive intent of its more famous siblings. The setup wasn't as sharp, the focus wasn't as pure. Park it next to anything else built in 1971 though, and it would embarrass almost every single one. Before the Tirana, before the Phase 3, before any of it, there was the HK Monaro 327. Australia's first proper muscle car arrived in 1968 with a Chevrolet 327 V8, pushing somewhere between 250 and 300 horsepower, and it genuinely shocked the country. Nothing local had ever looked or performed like this. It backed up the bravado at Bathurst that same year, winning outright, and in doing so, created something far bigger than a race result. It sits at 11 because everything it pioneered, the cars above it perfected. But the HK Monaro didn't just win a race, it created an entire culture, and every car on this list owes it a debt. If the HK Monaro lit the fire, this one poured the fuel. Released in 1967 with a 289 cubic inch Windsor V8, pushing around 225 horsepower, it was the first time Ford had a genuine Australian performance weapon. It sold out almost immediately, and the motoring press went into meltdown. Dealerships were reporting waiting lists for a car that had barely existed weeks earlier. By modern standards, 225 horsepower sounds modest, but context is everything. Nothing from Holden could touch it when it launched. The XR-GT didn't just start the Falcon GT legacy. It started the entire supercar war between Ford and Holden that would define Australian motorsport for the next decade. Up next, a Holden with official power numbers that every engineer who built it knew were a lie, and then the car above it that proved 6 cylinders could destroy a field of V8s. Here's something that should be impossible: a 202 cubic inch inline 6 going up against full V8 opposition at Bathurst. The Holden LJ Tirana GTR XU1 produced around 190 horsepower. That sounds modest until you realize the car weighed almost nothing. Engineers stripped it to the bone, tightened the suspension, and built something that handled with surgical precision. What it lacked in brute power, it obliterated in every other department. At Bathurst, where corners matter as much as straights, the XU1 came agonizingly close to winning outright, finishing second against full V8 opposition. It was the moment the entire paddock realized that power alone was never going to be enough. It permanently rewrote the rules of what an Australian performance car could be. The Chrysler Valiant Charger E38 was one of the greatest performance bargains this country has ever seen. The 265 Hemi 6, producing around 280 horsepower in a genuinely lightweight body, made it viciously quick. The Hemi 6 was an engineering masterpiece, smooth, tunable, and brutally effective. Straight-line acceleration was savage, and it turned heads everywhere it went. Only one thing held it back, and that was the 3-speed gearbox. Its faster sibling, the E49, ran a 4-speed, and that single difference costs it a higher position. It is the gap between a scalpel and a slightly less sharp scalpel. Either way, if one pulled up beside you at the lights in 1972, the smart move was to stay exactly where you were. We have entered the top 7. Every car from here is a genuine legend, including one Holden so dominant at Bathurst that rivals looked like they had showed up to the wrong race entirely. The Holden Tirana L34 was built for one reason: to win races, and road car requirements were an afterthought. The race-tuned 308 V8 produced numbers well beyond its official rating when properly prepared, and the L34 was homologated as a production vehicle purely to make it eligible for competition. Engineers who worked on it have since admitted the official power figures were deliberately conservative. On the track, in the right hands, it was ferocious. But it had a fatal flaw, and that was reliability. The L34 was raw, aggressive, and punishing, rewarding only those who truly knew how to manage it and destroying everything else. The more refined A9X that followed took everything the L34 pioneered and turned it into something that actually survived to the finish line. This Tirana produced around 240 horsepower from its 308 V8. On paper, that looks ordinary against the cars above it. On the track, it was anything but. At Bathurst in 1977, this car didn't just win, it swept the top 4 positions. The car's balance of power, handling, and braking was so superior that rivals looked genuinely outclassed, and the result sent shockwaves through every other manufacturer competing at the time. It wasn't just fast, it was perfectly engineered for the exact demands Australian circuits placed on a car. The A9X is the ultimate proof that horsepower on paper means nothing without a chassis to back it up. It sits at 6 because the cars above it were doing things that have never been repeated. We are now in the territory of cars so significant that governments got involved. Coming up, number 2 is a 6-cylinder that hit 100 faster than almost every V8 ever built in this country. And number 1 had its successor cancelled before a single example reached the public. The Phase 1 was the shot heard across Australian motorsport. The 351 Windsor V8, pushing between 290 and 300 horsepower, was the first true homologation special Falcon, engineered specifically to meet racing regulations and then sold to the public with number plates. Ford wasn't trying to build a comfortable touring car. They were building a weapon and adding compliance stickers, and the Australian public responded with immediate, overwhelming demand. It was the moment Ford stopped chasing Holden and started hunting them. Without the Phase 1, there is no Phase 2, and there is no Phase 3. It doesn't just belong on this list. It is the reason the top of this list exists. By 1969, Holden had learned exactly what the HK had taught them and came back with something meaner. The HT350 bolted Chevrolet's 350 cubic inch V8, producing 300 horsepower, into a platform Holden had tightened, refined, and aimed directly at Bathurst. Race success followed immediately. Every decision made in the development of this car pointed toward one outcome, and that was winning. It was Holden at their most focused, most aggressive, and most dangerous. Where the HQ that came later softened things in pursuit of comfort, the HT kept every edge sharp. It was a genuine racing machine wearing road car clothes, and in period very little in Australia could live with it. Decades later, it remains one of the most sought-after and fiercely contested cars at Australian classic auctions. The market has never forgotten what it was. The Phase 2 took everything the Phase 1 had proven and made it better. The 351 Cleveland V8, producing over 300 horsepower, came paired with refined aerodynamics, sharper development, and real lessons absorbed from race campaigns. In period testing, it regularly posted speeds that embarrassed far more exotic machinery from around the world. Journalists who drove it back-to-back with European performance cars came away genuinely stunned. It was the car that made the rest of the world take Australian engineering seriously for the first time. It sits at 3 only because of what arrived directly after it. The gap between Phase 2 and Phase 3 is razor-thin, but in a list, this elite razor-thin margins still decide everything. The Phase 2 wasn't surpassed. It was simply continued. Today, a genuine Phase 2 commands prices that would have seemed completely absurd to the engineers who built it. It is one of the most valuable Australian cars ever made, and every serious collector knows exactly why. 2 cars left. Both of them permanent entries in Australian legend. One is a 6-cylinder that hit 100 kilometres an hour faster than almost any V8 ever sold here. The other was so fast its successor was cancelled before a single example reached the public. A 6-cylinder faster than the V8s. That sentence still sounds impossible. The Chrysler Valiant Charger E49 ran the 265 cubic inch Hemi 6 with triple Weber carburettors, producing 302 horsepower gross. And it hit 0 to 100 in approximately 6 seconds. That number doesn't just beat most V8s of its era, it destroys them. The triple Weber Hemi 6 remains one of the greatest engines ever fitted to an Australian production car, and the sound alone was unlike anything else on the road. Lighter than a V8-powered rival, savage off the line, and terrifyingly fast for something with only 6 cylinders. It sits at number 2 for one reason only. Past 160 kilometers an hour, the Phase 3 began to pull away. In a drag race, the Charger wins. In the full race equation, at full speed, the Phase 3 is king. What makes the E49 story genuinely remarkable is that Chrysler achieved all of this without a V8. No other manufacturer in Australia ever came close to matching what that Hemi 6 did in this car, and none have seriously tried since. This is the one, the most complete performance car ever built in Australia. The 351 Cleveland V8 was officially rated at around 300 horsepower, a figure that engineers and historians have consistently argued was deliberately understated, with independent testing of the era suggesting the real number was significantly higher. Ford knew exactly what they had, and they downplayed it on purpose. At Bathurst, the Phase 3 wasn't just competitive, it was dominant. High-speed stability, torque delivery and aerodynamic balance came together in a package that no Australian manufacturer has genuinely matched since. It wasn't built to win one race. It was built to be the definitive answer to every performance question anyone dared to ask. The government's response said everything. When plans for a Phase 4 emerged, politicians and media panicked so severely about the car's capabilities that its successor was cancelled under political and media pressure before a single example ever reached the public. The Phase 3 became the final word. Australia built the most effective high-speed muscle car of its era, and then the country's own institutions made sure nothing like it could ever be built again. Today, a verified Phase 3 is among the most valuable cars ever sold on Australian soil, with prices reaching into the millions. It is not just a car anymore. It is the definitive proof of what this country was capable of, frozen in time because nothing was ever allowed to follow it. From the HK Monaro that started it all, to the six-cylinder giant killer that rewrote the rules, from the triple Weber Hemi that humiliated the V8s, to the Phase 3 that was simply too fast for its own successor to be allowed to exist. These weren't just muscle cars. They were a statement that Australia could build something that stood up to anything in the world, on its own roads, on its own tracks, with its own engineers. And for one extraordinary decade, they were absolutely right. If you enjoyed watching this video, like and subscribe if you want. Thank you for watching and goodbye.